Hey guys, we're back to continue our discussion of the lymph node. Here it is again. Look at that beautiful lymph node. We got afferent vessels. Dun 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 dun. Efferent vessel leaving. We know that we have more afferent than efferent, which creates a bottleneck effect, slows down the lymph. More time for filtering. So when lymph comes in, the afferent lymphatic vessels empty into a little leftover space in here. And the space in here is called the subcapsular sinus because it is just underneath the capsule. Then from the subcapsular sinus, we flow through spaces called cortical sinuses. And in the cortical sinuses, we're going to find two types of lymphatic tissue. Some lymphatic tissue in there is going to be diffuse. Don't say diffuse when you're using it as an adjective. It's diffuse lymphatic tissue or spread out lymphatic tissue. Then we'll also have some packed together lymphatic tissue called lymphatic or lymphoid follicles. They're also known as nodules. We see a nodule here. This is where the lymphocytes are really packed together. We're going to find B and T lymphocytes in here. We're going to find reticular fibers giving us our structure. And of course, we got B and T lymphocytes in here because, hey, that's where we're going to do the fighting, the immune protection. And by the way, when the B cells and T cells meet a particular foreign thing, that meeting is called antigen challenge. Antigen is a good word for any foreign thing that we might encounter and respond to. Okay, we go a little deeper into the medulla. All right, we get into the medulla in there. And in the medulla, we're going to have medullary sinuses. And the medullary sinuses pass pretty much rows, columns of lymphatic tissue called medullary cords. Also, there's spread out lymphatic tissue in here as well. There's diffuse tissue here. And again, everything is supported by reticular fibers. Now, interestingly enough, primarily in the medulla, we find just T lymphocytes. Whereas we find both in the cortex, we find just T lymphocytes in here. Notice we also don't have the follicles that we had in the outside. Follicles mainly in the outside. This is where we find clusters, which makes sense because this is where the incoming things are arriving. Okay. So what about the lymph node lymph flow? Your mnemonic device is ask me. Ask me about lymph node lymph flow. See if you can figure out what all these stand for. Check with me in the classroom. And of course, we got to have blood flow too. I mean, for the regular reasons, right? But also for lymphocytes to get in and get out. Lymphocytes need to be able to travel. All right? And once we start developing a lymphocyte army in response to an invader that is encountered, that is within the situation of antigen challenge, our lymphocyte army has got to be able to leave. And of course, we want to leave through the lymph, but also through blood. And of course, we see the artery and vein going in at the hilum. If we look at the histology here, this is the outside of the lymph node here. Okay, this is the purple cortex. Look how I have spread out purpleness, then these round clusters. These round clusters are follicles or nodules. Okay, on to the spleen. There it is, right there, protected by your last few ribs. There's our spleen right there. We see our splenic artery, which of course came off the celiac artery. We see our splenic vein, which of course is going to the hepatic portal vein. By the way, notice the stomach has been cut here. All right. Notice that we see a little bit of large intestine, a little bit of pancreas, a little bit of kidney, all that good stuff. And then we see some ribs, see diaphragm, lots of good stuff. All right, so the primary function of the spleen is to destroy beaten up, ugly, old red blood cells. It's also going to store minerals. It's going to store white blood cells and platelets. It's also going to be involved in destroying foreign things. It is a site of antigen challenge, just like lymph nodes are. Pretty much you can think about lymph nodes as the filterers of the lymph. and the spleen as the filter of the blood. The spleen is surrounded by a connective tissue capsule, has inward trabeculae. They're not super awesome looking to me. And we have a lot of reticular fibers in here because the spleen is a super soft organ. It is so soft it is hard to repair if it ruptures. A lot of times it'll just be surgically removed, and the liver and red bone marrow will take over much of its jobs. All right, as far as the blood flow of the spleen goes, so we knew in our celiac artery we had branches like the splenic artery. Splenic artery gets to the spleen, branches into trabecular arteries, which then branch into central arteries, which then give us splenic arterioles, which dive into the splenic cords, which we're going to have clusters of macrophages and lymphocytes. And we'll have sinuses, big capillaries, twisty capillaries. Then we'll get into some veins called pulp veins, trabecular veins, onto the splenic vein to exit. Now, here's our splenic vein, splenic artery. Of course, you should think about which would contain cleaner blood, which would contain blood with fewer ugly red blood cells. And notice the ribs are protecting it. Notice the spleen is kind of punched by the stomach, the kidney, and the colon. All right, we're looking at some blood flow here. So right here, we've got a nice central artery. Now, the central artery is surrounded by something called white pulp. White pulp is made out of lymphocytes. So remember, we want to monitor the blood for pathogens, and we want to be able to activate lymphocytes. And so we conveniently have lymphocytes around these central arteries, and this cluster of lymphocytes is known as white pulp. Now, in other regions, we don't have white pulp. We have red pulp. That is where we'll find the abundance of capillaries, as well as lots of macrophages and lymphocytes too. But the macrophages need to be there in order to look for those old, ugly red blood cells. And by the way, check out the trabecula right here. Check out the connective tissue capsule. All right. Here we see another view of the same thing. Notice the central artery right here, coming in, surrounded by white pulp, which is made out of white blood cells. Then we have all the capillaries and the sinuses, the spaces. And in here, we're going to have mostly blood, dying red blood cells that are living, macrophages to do the destroying. That's the basic tissue structure. Trying to make it as simple as we can here. Not too simple, but not too complex. So make sure to understand what red pulp and white pulp are in terms of what they contain and what they do. Here we see a histological section of the spleen. Here's the capsule up here, trabecula right here. The purple areas are the white pulp. Purple because they're so rich in lymphocytes. All this other stuff is the red pulp, rich in blood vessels, capillaries, sinuses, and of course, macrophages. All right, good deal. We'll stop here. Pick up next time.